evaluate this model, this narrative approach to conflict resolution, it has some consequences we have to consider. Estoy esperando para mis slides. Oh, yo estaba empezando.
Vamos a hacer una breve pausa para hacer unos ajustes técnicos con la presentación. Si nos dan unos 5 minutitos, por favor.
Okay, so me voy a hablar. Okay, so waiting for the slides, I'm going to tap dance. And I'll make a few comments about a narrative model. How many of you are familiar with a narrative approach to conflict resolution? Poco. Mucho. Okay. So just as a refresher, as a tap dance, the narrative model presumes that conflicts are constructed on the basis of stories that people tell. And the way the stories are formulated generate the conflicts, as well as offer opportunities for transformation and evolution. So it's like a different set of glasses. Beyond rational choice theory, because I was having an argument with folks before this meeting about whether or not rational choice theory, which is the foundation for negotiation, and was the foundation for mediation in the 90s and in the 80s and 90s, whether or not rational choice theory actually itself is a narrative, that people are going to act on the basis of their interests. That's a story, right? I think that leads us down the road to a set of assumptions that is problematic because it sets aside our emotions, our culture, our relationships, and you can't understand conflicts unless all those things are included. So the narrative model allows you to do that.
Entonces el modelo la narrativa
Still
es
tap
así.
dancing.
Es como un baile del tap.
And they're basically, just as a refresher, 3 components.
Y hay 3
To all
componentes como
narratives.
recordatorio en la narrativa.
There's a plot line,
Hay una línea de trama,
the
de la
sequence of
trama,
events that
y
people
una
are telling.
secuencia de eventos.
This happened, then this happened, then
Esto
this
pasó y
happened,
luego
then
esto
this
otro
happened.
pasó y esto otro pasó.
And in a conflict, that
Y en un
terminates
conflicto,
or leads to
eso
the
nos lleva
externalization of responsibility.
a la externalización de la
Right?
responsabilidad.
In a conflict, that's what the story works. That's how it
Eso es
works.
así es como
The
funciona la
second
historia en un
is
conflicto.
okay, estamos. The second is the characters, all
Los
the people that are
segundos son los
involved,
personajes
and the stories about them and who they are.
y las historias
And
de
the
ellos y
third
quiénes
is
son.
about the moral frameworks that people are
Son
laying
los marcos
down,
morales,
the systems of judgment,
los sistemas de
the
juicios
values that they're using to
Los
assess
valores que
the
están
actions of
usando.
self and other. Okay?
y demás.
Mille gracias. Okay, so this
Estoy
is
perdiendo un
sort of
poco
a
el sonido.
basic reminder of a narrative
Es un
model.
recordatorio de una
Now
narrativa.
I want to present you the problem
Quiero presentarles el problema
that we encounter in mediation. You can
que
see
enfrentamos en la
when you
mediación
start looking from a narrative lens
cuando estamos pensando
And the
estas,
problem
desde los lentes de la narrativa.
is violence.
Y el problema es la violencia
the violence that happens in a relationship where there's
que
so much
ocurre
pain,
en una relación.
the violence that happens, physical violence that can happen,
Y la violencia física que podría ocurrir.
the violence of marginalization,
Y la marginalización,
not having a
esa
voice,
violencia,
the violence of structural
violencia
systems
de las
which
estructuras
which oppress people and reduce their
que afecta a la
access.
gente.
So all these are different forms of
Entonces todas
violence
estas
that
son
appear
diferentes
in
situaciones
mediation.
que
Once
tienen
you
que ver
start
con la
looking
mediación. No estoy
from
oyendo
a
bien.
narrative lens.
El que se ve a través del lente de
So
la
this is
narrativa.
beyond physical violence to the
Más allá de la
violence
violencia física,
that is derived from
que
the
se
nature of the
deriva
stories that are being told
de las otras historias que se están
and the
diciendo,
context in which they're telling. So
en
today I
el
want to
contexto
talk
en que se
about
está diciendo.
once you put these narrative glasses,
Una vez que te pones estas gafas o
I want
anteojos
to
de la
talk about
narrativa,
the problems that narrative itself generates.
problemas que genera la
And it
narrativa en sí,
basically is narrative
básicamente
closure and
el
narrative
cierre de la
coherence.
narrativa,
That these stories are
las
tightly knit.
historias
When people
que
come to the
están
mediation, they
entrelazadas.
already have a tightly formed story
Cuando
that
ya
is
se tiene
organizing
formada una
and
historia,
structuring their own experience and the nature of the
Esta
conflict as it
experiencia.
unfolds.
no estoy
And
oyendo
it's our
bien.
job as mediators
Nuestro trabajo como
to
mediadores
destabilize this coherence,
es estabilizar la
to
coherencia,
open these stories.
que
And yet
abren
we're
las
struggling
historias
against the properties of coherence
y
and
batallar contra las
the
estructuras
thesis
de la coherencia. La tesis.
okay. Oh, quiero que chequear. ¿Quieres? Sí, está bien. Okay, so no estoy terminada con el primero. Okay, so the problem is
Entonces el problema
that narratives which contain
la
themselves
narrativa
violence,
que contienen violencia,
which must be destabilized
que
in a
se tiene
mediation
que
process,
desestabilizar,
have to work against narrative coherence and narrative closure. No, they have to work against closure and coherence.
El cierre y la coherencia.
Coherencia y la manera que la narrativa está cerrado. ¿Me entiendes? Okay. So, and I'm arguing here today that unless we can do this, we cannot tame violence.
Que se haga algo no se puede
Tame?
pacificar la violencia.
Well, ¿cuál es la palabra para tame? Eso. Okay. Perfecto. Okay. So, just to remind as a fresher, we're talking really now about
un
the
recordatorio, estamos
social
hablando de
construction of reality, right?
la construcción de la realidad.
And can I have this link? Can you play that link for me? I want
Si
you
me
to look
pueden
at
poner el
this.
enlace, por favor.
And
La liga.
before we play it, I want you to look. The
Antes
instruction
de
is
que salga,
to, I'm going to ask you when we're done looking at this what
les voy a
happened.
pedir
So get ready to tell me what
que
happened.
algunas cosas después de que terminemos.
¿Puede hacerlo? Yeah.
Luego se quita el micrófono, no lo oigo.
Solamente visual.
Que le pongan volumen a ella. Please keep your microphone close to your mouth because it's
Yes.
very hard for me to
Yes,
hear you.
disculpa. ¿Podemos tenerlo o no?
Can we have the video, please? El video, si lo pueden poner, por favor.
No puedo más. Bueno,
No se puede. Es que dice que
No
pongan
marcha.
el video.
no marcha.
It will take a little bit, please. Please wait.
Okay.
Están en eso. En un momento aparece el video.
So basically, I'm putting in front of you
Básicamente estoy poniendo
the
en
problem
frente
that,
el problema
that there is violence in people's lives.
de que hay violencia en la vida de la gente
And they come to mediation
y vienen a la mediación
telling the stories that both reflect that violence
diciendo la historia que refleja
and at
esa
some level
violencia.
reproduce that
En
violence.
cierto nivel nosotros producimos esa
So what are we
violencia.
going to do about it as
¿Qué
mediators?
vamos a
That's the
hacer al
problem.
respecto como mediadores?
Okay. Si no es posible, yo puedo caminar.
Si no es posible, yo puedo seguir o caminar.
No marcha.
No funciona.
Okay. Okay.
Bueno,
Vamos a... Basta con esto. Basta.
olvídenlo.
Bueno. ¿Y puedo tener la próxima?
Si pueden poner la siguiente diapositiva, por favor.
Ya está. Bueno, ya está con el video. Okay.
El video,
So-
por el momento, ya está.
In the 80s and 90s,
En los 80 y los 90,
people started in the early days of mediation.
al principio de la mediación,
Mediators had a representational
tenían
view of
un
language.
punto de vista sobre el lenguaje.
And we still
sobre
have
el
this in the
idioma,
courts.
El lenguaje.
There's a focus on
Había
as
un
though
enfoque
language represented reality,
En el idioma, en el lenguaje que se representaba.
with a focus on accuracy, that
Con
language is
un
going to
enfoque en precisión,
characterize the world accurately,
caracterizar
that we have
de manera
to
activa el
formulate
mundo,
objective
formular
descriptions that reflect that reality,
objetos que estaban reflejando la
that we're going
realidad.
to have truth or falseness.
Y
We have to
la
worry about
verdad,
that.
la veracidad o la falsedad.
That there is no attention to power and politics,
Y no hay atención al poder y a la política,
at least outside of the session.
por lo menos fuera de la sesión.
And the mediators worried about
Y los mediadores
not
se
getting the
preocupaban
accurate information and worried they got it
sobre
wrong.
la información que se les diera y que estuviera mal.
And they assumed that the
presuponían
representations were aligned with the interests that people made or that
Que
people had.
tenía que ver con el interés que tenía la gente.
And now we know differently.
Y ahora lo sabemos que es diferente.
Or let's say, in addition to this perspective on language, we have
Aparte de esta perspectiva del lenguaje,
a perspective on language that includes
que incluye
its role in constituting reality, not just representing
su
it.
rol en constituir la realidad, no solamente representarla.
So, as mediators, we're focused on the nature of the speech acts.
Nosotros, como mediadores, nos enfocamos
people are
en los
making.
actos de habla
What are
que
they
la gente está
doing
haciendo.
with language? What are they doing with the
¿Qué
language?
están haciendo con el idioma? ¿Qué están haciendo con el
I'm
lenguaje?
less worried about objectivity. I don't care about objectivity.
No me interesa tanto la
I'm
objetividad.
worried about what kind of
preocupa.
mobilization occurs,
¿Qué tipo de
how the
vocalización
stories
ocurre?
in the mediation
Las
session
historias,
mobilize folks
cómo movilizan a la
in the
gente
session and also in the social networks they're part of.
en la sesión y
I
también en
worry
las redes
about the
sociales.
language
Me preocupa el
colonizing
lenguaje,
or containing and restricting
cómo coloniza,
what
contiene
people can say or do or
lo
experience.
que la gente puede decir o hacer.
I'm not worried about science.
No me preocupa la ciencia.
So I have a daughter that's a climate scientist.
Tengo una hija que es científica
And she was in a living room one day with
y
25
está un
other,
día en la sala
she was in my living room with 25 other climate scientists.
con otros científicos
And I was running to and from the kitchen with
y andaba yo yendo y
with a
viniendo de la
vegan
cocina
chili,
con el platillo, con lo que iba a servir.
a vegan chili, a chili sin
Con
carne, ¿no?
con un chile
Porque la
tipo
gente que está cuidando para el clima no comen carne, ¿no?
porque los que están involucrados
¿Qué
con
cosa?
las cuestiones
Entonces,
climáticas no comen
yo estaba
carne.
corriendo así y dice
Y
mi
andaba
mami,
corre y corre.
yo puedo cambiar la lengua para para este chiste. Entonces,
Y voy a cambiar
ella,
esto para
ella me
decirlo
llama
en español.
a la living a decir, bueno,
Y
mami,
me llama
queremos
a la
entender,
sala.
bueno, me voy a inglés porque ella está mejor. Me voy
La voz no
con
se oye,
ella.
la de
Okay.
usted.
So she said, Mommy, come to the living
Dijo,
room
"Vente.
and explain to us why
Explícanos.
the science, we can't convince people even
Con la
though we
ciencia
have
no
the
podemos
facts."
convencer a la gente.
And I tell them,
Quiera esto. Y
science
les dije,
doesn't matter.
la ciencia no importa.
Why? Because
¿Por qué?
you don't listen.
Porque no pones atención, no
You
escuchas.
don't listen to what people are worried about. You don't
escuchas a
listen
lo
to
que le
what they
preocupa
care
a la
about.
gente.
You don't
Pero
understand.
escúchalos,
You're
no
not
entiendes.
even curious about their perspective
Siquiera te da
because you
curiosidad
think
su
everything is
perspectiva.
science. So
Piensan
we
que
know
todo
as
es ciencia.
mediators, science
Como
may be
mediadores,
nice, but it's a
la-
luxury. We
La
have to
ciencia
focus
es
instead on
importante, es un lujo.
the perspectives of the people, and that's where
Son
the
las
reality
perspectivas de la
sits,
gente.
in those descriptions, not in some
En las
abstract.
descripciones.
Okay. And we're really paying attention to the stories that both
Y estamos
reflect and
poniendo
create
atención a,
the
la,
social
a las
networks, right?
historias.
A ver, okay, now, these stories that come to
Estas
our
historias
sessions are usually very closed. They're
están muy
a closed
cercanas
system
en el
because the plot
Pero la trama
fits with the characters,
y
which
los
fits with the
personajes ponen a los
values.
personajes, le ponen valores.
And the narrative is protecting
narrativa
itself. It provides its own closure and coherence.
Proteger y que
hands like
dé
this
cierre y cohesión.
to show
Coherencia.
these narratives are not open.
Estas
And they do
narrativas
not
no
want
están
to open.
abiertas.
If you talk to a father
Si
about
hablas con un padre,
how much he's tried to be a good father,
¿hasta qué punto está intentando ser buen padre?
you can't convince him he's been a bad father.
No lo puedes
You can
convencer
bring
de que
all
sea
the
un mal padre.
examples,
Puede traer
all the
todo,
examples you want,
los ejemplos que quieras.
and the wife will bring them for you.
Y la esposa te los va a traer
He won't change his mind.
y no va a cambiar
So
su punto de vista.
these narratives are, it's
Estas
not that
narrativas,
people are not resistant, the stories are
la
resistant
gente no se
because they
resiste.
have this internal coherence.
Tienen esta coherencia interna.
And these stories inevitably, these conflict
Y
stories
las
inevitably lead
historias
to
de conflicto
silence.
inevitablemente
People are
traen silencio.
silenced. They live in more fragmented
La gente viven
relationships,
en forma más
and they end up
fragmentada,
being isolated. So
más aislados.
basically, the stories have terrible consequences for their
Entonces las
lives.
historias tienen consecuencias terribles.
Okay, so, and this is a repetition of just as what I said,
es
which you
una
have
repetición de lo que
plots,
acabo de decir.
characters, and values
Los personajes,
that
los
work
valores,
together to create narrative coherence. And in a
crean una
conflict,
coherencia narrativa.
the plots are extremely linear and
Las tramas
simplistic.
son totalmente
The
lineales.
characters are either have white hats or black hats on,
Los personajes traen
very
su sombrero
simplistic,
blanco
and the
o
value
negro.
systems are simple. There's only
Los
one way to
valores son
be
simples.
good and only
Hay
one
una
way to
forma
be bad.
de ser.
So this is what's
Bueno,
problematic about these. The
Esto es
stories are
problemático.
simplistic. The stories are simplistic, and they
Las historias son
reproduce.
simples
They reproduce the trauma.
y
They
reproducen
actually
el
are
trauma.
producing trauma. They're producing conflict
Están
and violence.
produciendo
They are themselves violent. These stories. That's what I'm arguing.
Violencia en el
They don't have to
conflicto,
be
eso es lo que
about
estoy
violence
diciendo.
to be violent, because they restrict
tiene que
people's
ser
capacity to
violentas,
construct
esta es la
themselves
capacidad
in a new way. But also,
De estructurar las cosas
they're
de otra
tied to
forma.
depression. I did some
Y
research,
también están vinculadas
for this
con la
lecture,
depresión.
and
en esta
there's a
charla
very clear association to a
Hay una
story
asociación muy clara
that lacks agency.
que les falta la capacidad, la habilidad de actuar.
Right. People come and say, I'm helpless.
La gente dice, no puedo hacer nada
I don't know what to do.
y no sé qué
I've
hacer.
tried this. I've tried this.
Intenté esto
I'm
y
helpless.
esto otro.
And this
No
helplessness,
puedo hacer nada.
these stories
Esta
are
incapacidad
tied to
de
depression.
actuar me lleva a la depresión.
Stories where people have no agency are
Donde las historias donde la gente no tiene capacidad de acción
they're correlate to depression.
se correlacionan con la depresión.
So they increase depression, and that in
Aumenta la
turn
depresión.
depression is associated to social isolation, right?
Y esto de la depresión está vinculada con
You don't
un
have
aislamiento.
ties to networks.
social, que no
And
hay
it's
vínculos,
also
no
tied
hay
to trauma.
redes.
It's also tied to trauma.
Y también está vinculado con
So
el
these
trauma.
conflict stories that people have are tied to depression, and they are
Estas
generating
historias
trauma,
tienen que ver con la depresión y generan
which
trauma.
is terrible for the people involved. I'm trying to get us to develop
Es
our
difícil
perspective on the
para
consequences of
desarrollar
these narratives.
una perspectiva sobre la
These
consecuencia.
problematic stories are produced
Estas
through
historias
a series of interactions, right? It takes interaction
generan
to make a story
interacciones
and to reproduce the story.
para reproducir la
Now,
historia.
Gregory Bateson argued that there are two
Se decía
levels of
que
language all the time. Two levels.
Siempre hay dos.
One level is the
Niveles de
content
lenguaje.
of what people are saying, which
El
I
contenido de
I
lo
don't
que
have
dice la gente.
visitation. I don't have visitation anymore. I don't have
No tengo
enough
las
money.
visitas.
I lost my job. My employer's unfair. Whatever.
Es injusto mi patrón, o sea, no tengo esto y lo otro.
But the other, more important, is the
Pero la
proposal.
otra más
The second
importante,
level, which is called the proposal
nivel,
or report phase. And Bateson
que es
called
la
it
fase
report,
del
but it's really a
informe, del
proposal.
reporte.
So everything that anybody says
Todo lo que dice
all
todo
the
el
time
mundo, todo el tiempo,
is a proposal to you as a
es
listener.
una propuesta para usted.
It's a proposal that is, let's say, like a set of flowers. And they give
Como
you
si
this,
fuera un ramo de
they give you a
flores.
description, and it
Te
is a
dan una
proposal.
descripción
And then
y
they
la
have to
propuesta.
wait. Are you going to
y
say
ahora
no?
tienen que esperar.
I don't want that. Or are you going to
No
say
quiero
yes?
esto,
I'll
o voy a que
thank you
sí.
for sharing this. And basically,
Y
in a
gracias por
mediation,
compartirlo.
every proposal that people are making needs to
cada
be
propuesta que hace la gente
explored, affirmed at some level,
se
affirmed and
afirma a
explored.
cierto nivel.
Because, and that's how that's how mediators
porque
build
así es
a
como
relationship and how they join others. Is through
ocurre en la relación y cómo se unen a
elaborating
otros.
these proposals that people are making, right? And some of these terms
Hablando
are
sobre
more
estas,
critical to the
elaborando sobre
evolution of
estas
the
situaciones.
conflict than others.
Y
Now,
otras son más críticas en el conflicto que en otras.
so let's see. Whoops. Yeah. So as the conflict progresses,
Y al aumentar el conflicto,
okay, as the conflict progresses
al
and
seguir
it
adelante el
unfolds
conflicto,
in your mediation sessions
en las
and
mediaciones,
unfolds in
en
their
las sesiones de
lives,
mediación,
it's more and more simple.
es
Simple.
más y más simple.
There's a process of simplification
Hay un
over
proceso de
time, and you can
simplificación.
see this in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You can
Y se
see
ve
it
en
in
el
your
conflicto
own
israelita-palestino.
family conflicts. You can see it. How many of you are having
Y también
conflicts
en los
right now?
conflictos familiares.
How many of you have conflicts right now?
¿Cuántos de ustedes tienen conflictos ahora?
Levanta la mano, por favor.
Levanten la mano, por favor, quienes tienen
Sí.
conflictos.
Okay. So you know this from your
Ustedes
own
saben esto.
experience. That first
primero-
somebody gets positioned as delegitimate.
Se posiciona como deslegitimado.
The story externalizes responsibility.
La historia externaliza la
Other people
responsabilidad.
stop listening. The
Y otra
listening
gente empieza a
stops.
escuchar.
They're very, very thin plot lines. A lot of
Y
events get
unas
left
tramas
out.
muy delgadas, muy
And
ligeras.
basically, this creates and
Y
solidifies this
básicamente crea
binary moral frameworks. So they
unos
get
marcos
progressively more
binarios
simple the more they're
morales.
told, right?
Primero es
So when
simple
you
y
tell
luego
your
se
mother
dice. Pero cuando le
about
dices a
all
tu
the terrible
madre
things your spouse did,
de todas las cosas que hizo tu cónyuge, tan
your narrative
terribles,
gets simpler over time, unless the mother is a very good
la-
mother.
y,
and
y
she's going
entonces lo
to
hace más
break
simple
up the coherence of that.
y se levanta
So-
la coherencia.
Oh, basically, what happens is that narratives,
Básicamente lo
I
que
want
se-
to
lo
say,
que
have their
sucede
own authority. They
Su
become,
propia autoridad.
they are the descriptions that people make, the stories
Las
that they tell,
descripciones o
have
las
their own
historias que hace la
authority.
gente
Now, Renee Girard says
hace.
that
Resolution dice,
he wrote a book called Violence and the
escribió un
Sacred,
libro que se denomina Violencia, no
and
escuché el nombre completo,
he says that
y dice que
we tell stories to
decimos
establish
historias
who's the victim and
para
who's the
establecer quién
victimizer.
es la víctima y el victimario.
That's what we do. And that's
Eso
what
es lo que
lots of
hacemos.
what narrative is supposed to do, is
Y lo
is
que debe
differentiate the victim from the victimizer. So we
Es
stand
definir
over,
cuál es uno y cuál es otro.
we stand over the body of the victim. Look at a car.
Estamos al lado de la víctima.
Think of a car accident.
En una
You drive by the car
en un
accident,
accidente,
and what is everybody doing on the
Automovilístico.
road? Everybody's looking, right?
y todo el mundo está viendo, ¿verdad?
Why do we look? We look
¿Por qué
because
vemos?
we're
Póngale uno de su
witnessing the
lapa,
body of the victim.
Porque se mueve el micrófono.
And in the car, what are we doing? We're
Estamos
telling the
viendo, ¿qué
story.
vemos?
We're telling the story.
Estamos diciendo la
They fell
historia.
asleep. They had too much to drink.
Había,
And then you go home.
Se había emborrachado,
You go home,
había,
and there's
se quedó dormido.
My husband and I were in D.C. January 6th
Estábamos en enero, mi esposo y
of
yo
2020
en Washington,
when there was a storm, an invasion of the Capitol.
cuando invadieron el Capitolio ese
And you
día.
watched all the representatives run for their
Y vimos
lives.
cómo corrieron todos los representantes, todos los diputados.
And everybody watching television all over the
Y todo el
country,
mundo estaba viendo la televisión en todo el
we
país.
were making sense of the victims and
Estábamos
telling
teniendo
stories about the
sentido de las
perpetrators.
víctimas y estábamos
What were they
diciendo la
doing?
historia
Why
de
were they
los
doing that?
responsables.
Where,
¿Por qué lo
where
están
did they come
haciendo?
from? What did they care
¿De
about?
dónde vienen? ¿Qué les
And
importa?
everybody was very clear who's the
Y a
victim
todo
and
el
who's
mundo
the
le quedaba
victimizer,
claro quiénes
right?
son las víctimas.
So this narrative does that. Narrative establishes
Hace la
this
narrativa,
division
establece
between victim and victimizers. And
¿Dónde están las
then
víctimas y los
this is
victimarios?
adopted and circulated in social
Se
media.
adopta y se circula.
So it becomes
sociales.
concretized in social media. So narrative has a
Se
power
concreta en las
to,
redes sociales.
to reproduce itself, telling more of
Para
these stories. And it, of
reproducirse
course,
y
becomes the
dando más
foundation for
historias.
action, right?
Y entonces ya viene el fundamento para la acción.
You're going to do things because of the stories you're telling. So
Vamos a
it's
hacer cosas
it's
por
the
las historias que
architecture
están
for
diciendo,
action.
la arquitectura.
Now, I did some research on
Hice alguna investigación
penalty
sobre
phase of capital trials. And in
lo
the
de
United
los,
States,
juicios del Capitolio.
in the United States, when we have capital trials,
En Estados Unidos tenemos estos juicios del Capitolio
we have a phase called the penalty phase.
y hay una fase que se denomina la pena
And there, people can testify
y la gente puede
to
atestiguar
the problems the
de
victimizer
los
had.
problemas que
They were
tenía la
beaten as a
víctima,
child. They were in
que le
foster
pegara-
care.
el
They had
victimario,
all
que
these
le pegaron
problems.
de niño
In
y
order
demás,
to reduce
para reducir
or to increase the complexity of that character,
para
right?
aumentar
They're not
la
just a
complejidad.
victimizer, they are also a victim. So then
no,
I
no
read,
solamente de la víctima, sino del victimario que también es víctima.
so I studied the penalty phase
Estudié la
process
fase de la pena
and what people said. And
y lo que
then
dijo la gente.
I
Y,
looked at the jury verdict, the
y
verdict of the
vi
jury, who
el
decides
veredicto del
guilt
jurado
or innocence. And I found
sobre
that
culpable o inocente.
the-
Encontré
in the jury trials, where
que en
the
estos juicios con jurado,
where the narrative was incredibly simple, had a simple moral point,
que tenía un punto moral simple cuando era
those won
increíblemente simple.
the jury verdict. So
Y ese era uno, era el veredicto del jurado.
you could distinguish these
Podías
narratives of
distinguir
violence
La
by
violencia,
using a 2x2 design,
utilizando un diseño de 2x2.
where you have some stories are very
Tiene
complex.
ciertas historias que
There's a
son muy
lot of
complejas,
factors involved.
Los
There's sort of
factores que
gray
están
moral
involucrados,
territory.
territorio moral,
And the moral territory is kind of less visible, slightly more
que es menos
obtuse,
visible,
and versus the very simplistic story
y la historia muy
that has a
simplista,
very transparent moral framework
que tiene un
instead of an
marco
obtuse
moral
one.
muy
And of
simple.
course, number 3
claro,
is
el
what
número
all
tres,
that's what won the trials.
eso es lo que
So the
gana
jury
esos juicios.
picked up those stories and made the decision around guilt or innocence based on
Que
whichever
tomaron
side
esas historias para determinar
was
si era
most-
culpable o inocente.
was a simple narrative with a moral transparency.
Tenía que ver con el modelo
That's what we
simple
like.
de esa transferencia moral.
That's what we like. That's why we're
Transparencia
comfortable.
moral es lo que nos gusta,
So
es lo que,
when
con
you're
lo que
in your
estamos
mediation
cómodos.
sessions
Cuando estás en las sesiones de
and people are
mediación,
making these very simple
y la gente
stories
están haciendo estas
with very
historias
simple
simples,
moral
la gente,
points, look out,
puntos morales muy simples,
because those are going to perpetuate violence. Those are going to be
esos van a
problematic.
perpetuar la violencia.
Now, if you talk to people who have
Si hablo con la
themselves,
gente,
whether it's women, victims of domestic
las
violence,
mujeres que sean víctimas de
or,
la violencia doméstica,
men that have lost custody of their
hombres que han
children,
perdido la custodia
or
de sus hijos,
you know, whether it's those sort of personal dramas, or it could
esos
be
dramas personales,
someone who was felt discriminated in an
o alguien
organization.
que se sintió
No matter
discriminado,
what the violence was,
independientemente de qué tipo de violencia sea,
oftentimes they're not able to make sense of it.
a veces no le encuentran sentido.
The story about how it
La
happened is
historia
unclear
de
to
cómo
them.
pasó
It's not well formed. It's
No
got
está bien
pieces that
formada.
are left out. So, for
se quedan
instance,
las piezas fuera.
if you look at people subjected to violence,
Si
and I'm
ven a la
talking about
gente que
to
está
violent
sujeta
narratives,
A unas
they have
narrativas
a
violentas,
reduction in declarative memory. What is
tiene
declarative
que ver con
memory?
la
Declarative
memoria
memory is facts.
declarativa. Esos
That
son
was
los
last
hechos.
Tuesday. There was 300 of these facts,
Había
things that have to do
todos
with
estos hechos, había 300 de estos,
details
etcétera.
of our
Los
lives.
detalles
They
en nuestra vida.
lose the details.
Pierden
That
los
portion
detalles.
of the brain shrinks with trauma. So
Con el
this is
trauma se
a neurological
encoge el
problem,
cerebro.
right? And also people are no longer
también
able to make a connection
La gente ya no
between
puede
the
relacionar
events, these traumatic events,
de
and their
los,
own personal lives.
eventos dramáticos.
So for instance, the father that
ejemplo,
loses custody of his children,
Pierde custodia el padre sobre los
he
hijos.
doesn't know who he is.
No sabe
Who
quién
is he?
es.
He can't connect this
No
event
puede conectar
to the rest
este
of his
evento
life.
con el
The
resto
same
de
is
su
true of
vida.
victims of car accidents or
Las
people who
víctimas
have
de
been
accidente
marginalized or discriminated,
automovilístico,
etc.
o que
So,
están marginalizados,
There is a
discriminados.
reduction of narrative coherence
Hay
when
una
the
reducción
violence
de-
is high. When it's the
de
more trauma,
coherencia.
basically,
Cuando
the more
es
trauma,
entonces entre más trauma, hay más violencia
the less coherence.
y hay menos coherencia.
So now it becomes your problem. I'm
Ahora
basically
ya
here
es tu
today
problema,
suggesting it's your
básicamente.
problem as mediators,
¿Cuál es
people
el
that are doing the
problema?
work in mediation,
Vamos a trabajar como
that
mediadores.
that our job is not just to get an
Nuestro
agreement.
trabajo
Our job
No nomás es
is
encontrar
to
un acuerdo.
open up and destabilize
Es
these
abrir
coherent stories and
y
help people
estabilizar las historias de coherencia
rebuild the
para
connections
sanar, para
between
reconstruir
their own life story and
su
these
propia
events,
historia de vida,
increasing that kind of coherence and reducing the
aumentando la
internal
coherencia
coherence of the narratives. So if you analyze trauma
interna
narratives,
de la
here's what they
narrativa.
sound like.
Vean cómo se ve.
And you'll hear them when people come to the sessions, no matter
Y
what the
los escuchan
difficulty
cuando
they're
viene la
having.
gente a las sesiones.
They'll tell you the initial event.
Te dicen el evento inicial,
They'll tell you how they responded to it.
no te dicen cómo respondieron.
And they'll talk about all that they did
Y
to try to
van a
change
hablar de
it,
todo lo que hicieron,
all the attempts they made,
todos los intentos que
and what are
hicieron.
the consequences of those attempts.
Y cuáles fueron las
That
consecuencias de
is the
esos
feature,
intentos.
that's a trauma story right there.
Esa es la historia del
It's a
trauma.
story about I
Así
can't help it, this happened, I couldn't do anything about it,
pasó
I
esto, no
tried,
pude hacer
I
nada al
couldn't fix it.
respecto para
So
arreglarlo.
most of the conflict stories we hear in mediation stories,
mayoría de
and
las
mediation
historias del
sessions, I'm
conflicto
arguing, are trauma narratives.
Son de
So
trauma,
if you
narrativas
look
de
at
trauma.
the research on trauma narratives
La
that is done
investigación
from a
sobre
quantitative
narrativa de
perspective,
trauma
what you
se ve
see
desde el punto de
is
vista
that there's
cuantitativo.
a very high use of what they call high
Hay un
emotional
gran uso
language, high
de
emotional
este
language,
idioma.
and a high, it's called high
Lenguaje.
EE, high expressed emotion. And
Y
we know that
emociones
from
expresadas
ourselves, you know.
muy alto.
People don't respond when there's a lot of
La gente no
emotion.
responde
They're responding with
cuando
a
hay
lot of
emoción.
intensity, tears,
Es más
often
intensidad, hay lágrimas, como responden.
sorrow, frustration, all those things. So the higher it is, the more traumatic,
pena.
right?
Entre
And if you
más
look at
esto
people
sea, va a ser
exposed
más
to
traumático.
trauma in childhood versus adult
¿Y
onset,
cómo sería lo del trauma de un niño
you
contra
find people,
un adulto?
children will
comparado.
sustain this more
niños
higher emotional language throughout life.
Van a mantener todo,
So-
como niños van a mantener ese lenguaje alto.
So I guess the
En ese
point
nivel.
of this is
El
to
punto de esto
share with you my worry that
es
unless we
compartir
address
mi
these trauma
preocupación.
narratives,
entre
all the
menos
people
nos enfoquemos en esta situación
that these
de trauma,
parties
lenguaje
interact
narrativo,
with are going to be subjected to those stories, including children,
la gente que está
that are
sujetos
going to
a
be
esos,
then
a esos
impacted
dramas van a estar
for the rest of
sujetos
their lives
desde el lenguaje
by,
por el resto de su
by
vida,
this high emotionality, which is
que van a ser muy
reduces
emocionales.
declarative memory, reduces rationality, all those
Reduce la
things. So
racionalidad, la memoria declarativa.
this is a slide that simply
Esta es
shows
una
you
diapositiva
what
que
people
nos muestra
do when they try to tell you what
qué se
happened.
hace cuando
They'll
tratan
tell
de
you a main
decirte
plot line, which is what A
qué
through D
hicieron.
is. You know,
Te van a
that's
decir una
the
línea
main
de la
plot
trama
line on the horizontal
principal.
level. And
A nivel
then
horizontal.
other people
Y otra gente
will begin to try to
empieza
reframe or reorganize
a reorganizar
the meaning of this first
el
level.
significado.
So then you see the second level where everybody's saying, no,
luego
no,
ves el
that wasn't
segundo
on a
nivel.
Tuesday, it was on a Thursday, or no, that wasn't
Fue
raining
jueves,
that day,
no fue
or no,
jueves.
I didn't leave my children alone that day, or
yo
no,
no dejé a mis hijos.
I did finish that project on time.
Si terminé el proyecto a tiempo.
And then you see this another
luego
level, the
ves
top level,
otro
being,
nivel más arriba,
again, the efforts of other people to
los
stabilize
esfuerzos de otras personas para
what it is
estabilizar
that they said on the first level. So
lo que
when
dijeron en
when
el
you
primer
track
nivel.
the stories that are appearing in your
Y
mediation
vas
sessions,
rastreando las
you can
historias
see
que
the
salen en
struggle
mediación y puedes ver
to
la
establish
lucha
the storyline and then to
para
hang on
establecer
to
la
it.
línea de la historia y seguir
And they're hanging on to it by layering up
Poniendo
the
capas,
levels of
manteniéndolo, teniendo capas
episodes.
de episodios.
Now, when you talk to people who are telling
Cuando hablan con la
traumatic
gente que están
stories or
diciendo
stories of
la
trauma,
historia, las historias de trauma,
they're gonna tell you all the adverse or bad things that
van a
happened
decirte todo
that are
lo que fue
associated to
adverso,
that.
lo que fue mal, lo que está asociado con
They
ello.
might talk about attempts to withdraw.
Mejor hablan de
They have an
intentos
altered view of self,
de una vista alterada de sí mismos.
and they're more likely to be subjected to, or they're more
Y
likely
que
to say
tienen más probabilidad de
violence is
sujetarse,
routine or it's ordinary.
A la violencia como algo ordinario.
So at the interpersonal level in the
A
sessions,
nivel interpersonal en la sesión,
we need to increase this is to
Necesitamos
undo trauma,
aumentar
basically. To undo
esta
trauma, you've got to
situación de
thicken the
deshacer
plot
el trauma,
lines, increase the complexity of the stories so they're not
aumentar la
so simple.
complejidad de la historia.
You've got to build nuance into the
Hay
character
que
descriptions, either adding more
meterle más a
characters
la
or more
descripción
complexity to the characters. And
a
you've
los
got to
personajes.
increase the complexity of the moral
Y
frameworks.
aumentar la complejidad del marco moral.
And this is basically through, the elaboration of the
Y
stories
esto,
and et cetera.
Es a través de
I don't
elaborar
really have
más
time
o
to
de
do that.
aumentar
So-
más en la historia.
I'm using this model, this
Estoy
trauma,
usando
narrative
este
trauma
modelo
model, to help groups
para
do
ayudar a los grupos
what they're calling narrative campaigns. So there's a
las
large
campañas
growing
narrativas.
literature on narrative campaigns. And basically that is,
este
how do
énfasis que hay en estas
how do
campañas.
we put out a story
¿Cómo sacar una
about who we
historia
are that's going
de
to
quiénes somos?
be good for peace, that's going to support peace building?
Que apoye más, que
And the
respalde más
literature
la paz.
shows that the best
la
thing to do,
literatura
where do you
dice
start? With stories of suffering.
Que hay que empezar con historias
Because
de
that's what's going
sufrimiento.
to capture the public's
lo que va a
attention,
capturar
is the
la
story of
atención del
suffering,
público.
and you
De
leverage
sufrimiento.
all those instances where people
Y
have
luego
transformed
vienen todas
themselves,
esas instancias donde,
and they've been witnessed by national leaders and
donde
these
se
stories
haya
of
trabajado
bright
en esto
spots.
y-
A bright
y
spot is some kind of episode that turned out
los
well.
líderes lo
And
ven,
then these are memorialized or ritualized. So
y luego ya se
this
hacen como
slide is to
ritual o
tell
como
you,
memorias.
I know you're thinking about mediation,
Yo sé que
but
están
other
pensando en
people are
mediación,
also
pero
thinking about
otra gente piensa
the use
también
of narrative for
en el uso de las
addressing
narrativas
conflict in a broader social context,
para
right?
poder manejar el conflicto en un
But also I
ambiente
wanted
más
to,
social más amplio.
there are a whole lot of tools, and we're
Y
working
hay
on some of
muchas
those in the workshop,
herramientas
that are derived from narrative theory that
que
can be
deriven de
used
la
for
teoría
supporting
de
the
la
evolution
narrativa
of
que
story and its
respaldan
development, right?
esto.
And there are tools for,
Y hay herramientas
for building,
para
improving
construir,
relationships and reducing the violence
mejorar las
through some of
relaciones y
these. And I'm
bajar
not
el
going to
nivel de
describe all these.
violencia.
Just know that they're there. These tools are there.
Nomás para
And
que
in
sepan
conclusion,
que
I
hay
guess I
esas
want
herramientas.
to say that
Y también
increase of narrative complexity, which is your
Al
work
aumentar
to
la
increase the
complejidad de la
complexity of the
narrativa,
stories that are told, reduces trauma.
Las historias, esto.
And that's, I believe, I'm adding this. I'm basically here saying, this is not just about conflict resolution. It's not just about getting agreements. It's about addressing and redressing these trauma narratives and reducing it. It's about, and that's my core message. And I believe that what we're trying to do is reduce trauma and depression and negative experiences associated to conflict. From this perspective, mediation is not just a strategy for getting agreements, it's a process of healing. I'm basically proposing it's a process of healing. And just because I know everybody's excited and upset about the difference between therapy and mediation, let me end by saying, if you look at the word therapy, the root of the word therapy is health.
Tiene que ver con la salud.
And the root of the word health is wholeness.
Y la raíz de la salud.
So I'm basically arguing that the increase of complexity of narratives is healing because it increases the wholeness of the narrative. And we don't end up with these skinny stories. We've got more holistic stories about what's going on. So I guess I'm here to invite you to consider the relationship between trauma and mediation. That's basically what I'm here to do, to say I'm very worried about our efforts in mediation if we don't understand that these stories are trauma producing and we don't consider what we're up against in terms of narrative coherence. That's our enemy. Our enemy is narrative coherence, of keeping these stories simple as opposed to opening them to alternative descriptions. Ya está. This is really about what I'm basically saying is that if we tame violence as restoring in the mediation sessions, we do that with others. This is about freedom, real freedom for the parties. That's it. Do you have any questions or considerations or reflections? Sí, yes. Micrófono.
Thank you so much for your words. I think that it
Gracias por su trabajo.
And it is very excited. I'm very excited to hear things like this from yourself. All right, in person. Now, my question is, how can we tell the
Mi pregunta es cómo podemos decir
really tiny line between therapy and this kind of new method of using this circular narrative?
Is
there any clue? I mean, do we need to have a certain kind of training in this, like in a psychology kind of stuff or something like that?
No.
En esas cosas?
So here's my answer to this, which is a legitimate, good question.
Que es muy buena pregunta.
I think that the more we can understand narrative dynamics, the more fluid and flexible we'll be with interacting with them. So now I've made a problem for all of you today, and that was my job, was to give you a problem, which is the stories. The problem is the stories that people come with are trauma narratives. Now what are you going to do? That's my question. So I don't think we need traditional psychological, psychiatric categories. Why? Because this is a narrative model. We're looking at the stories that people are telling, not at their intrapsychic processes or their psychological right? I don't think we need that, because the object of our analysis is not the
el
internal
análisis.
psyche of individuals. The object of analysis
la
is the
psique
stories
del
themselves.
individuo,
But,
es
you know,
la
this is
persona
my,
en sí, más bien.
that's my radical perspective, you know, and
Thank you
Esa
so
es
much.
mi perspectiva
I understand
radical.
that may be a radical perspective.
Thank you. I
Tal
really
vez sea
appreciate it.
radical mi perspectiva.
You have another question or reflection
¿Alguna
or
otra
thought?
pregunta o reflexión?
Yeah, we have one here. Ruben?
Una por acá.
So I'm sorry to give you bad news today. That you're dealing with trauma
Siento
narratives.
mucho que les dé malas noticias, que están enfrentando traumas.
Thank you very much, Sara, for your great lecture. Muchas gracias, Sara, por tu conferencia. Lo voy a decir en español la pregunta.
Okay.
¿Cuál sería el concepto? Digamos, entiendo el modelo, pero ¿cuál sería una definición una definición? What would be a definition of the narrative closer? I mean, I understand that.
Right.
Del cierre de la narrativa,
Sí.
¿cuál sería la
Sí,
definición?
entiendo que tenemos que deconstruir esta coherencia narrativa que viene de las historias que han venido contando, pero el cierre en sí sería esta deconstrucción, o lo estoy entendiendo
Okay,
mal.
here, let's do this closure, okay? Let's watch it.
Vamos a ver lo de la
Thank you
del
so much.
cierre.
Thank you so much for coming to the session today.
Gracias por venir a esta sesión.
And I want to hear a little bit about how
Quiero
you
escuchar un poco
understand your role in
Para entender su rol.
this conflict. Can you tell me a little bit about
el
it?
conflicto. ¿Me puede decir un poco de eso?
Ya, bueno, mi rol en este conflicto ha sido el organizar eventos donde hay que traer a mucha gente y bueno, y entonces me ocupa en muchas situaciones que tengo que estar viendo al mismo tiempo.
Okay, so I'm not quite unsure. You have
Organize events, and then I have to bring a lot of people, and I'm busy with a lot of situations going on.
okay, and how is this a conflict? Because that's just work.
¿Y de qué manera es
Right.
un conflicto?
So where's the conflict in this?
Yeah,
¿En dónde está el conflicto?
because it involves a lot of issues that I have to take care of.
Oh, I wonder whether or not
Muchas
people
cosas que
get
tengo que
upset with
manejar.
you because you're the boss.
Pues
Yeah,
usted es el jefe.
yeah, maybe.
Could be.
Yeah, it could be.
So you
Podría
find
ser.
what you're really telling me is you're in difficult
está
position all the time, trying to
Es
get
que está
people
tratando
to
de manejar,
collaborate and get things done on time,
elaborar y que salgan las
and you
cosas a
have to
tiempo.
push things like that.
Yeah,
Tiene
yeah,
que
that's
empujar
right.
las cosas.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we're going to hear the coherent narrative. So he's given us a little bit
Vamos a ver la
of
coherencia
story of
narrativa.
this. So
A ver, la historia otra vez.
he's told a story of
Ha dicho una historia
what his objective is, right?
de cuál es su objetivo.
So why are you doing this? Why
¿Por
do
qué
you
lo
have this
hace?
role?
Because I want people to know and understand that there's a way to solve conflicts in a
Right.
greater way
Porque quiero que sepa la gente cómo, que hay manera de
So you have
estos
the
conflictos.
goal of
Tiene
opening
la meta
the doors of learning for
de abrir
many
las
people.
puertas del aprendizaje.
That's right.
It's a wonderful aspiration, right?
Es una
But the
aspiración
problem is-
maravillosa. El problema es que
Do people want to go? Do
La
people want
gente
to walk
quiere
through the
ir.
door?
quiere entrar por la puerta,
Yeah, I guess so.
Maybe.
supongo,
Maybe.
But you're not sure.
Yeah,
pero no
not
está
really.
seguro.
Look at these people that maybe they didn't want to come to this lecture
A lo
today.
mejor hay gente que no quería venir a esta charla.
Okay, so now I'm going to get down to it. So basically, this is not just
Vamos a profundizar.
probably herding cats problem.
No es algo así como de andar manejando ganado.
No.
Okay, really underneath this, you
Debajo
have
de
to
esto-
you are trying to get people to do things they may not want to do.
Quieres que la gente haga
I'm not
algo
talking
que a lo
about the
mejor la
audience.
gente
I'm
no
talking
quiere
about
hacer.
your collaborators, your
Estamos
people that are
hablando
working
de
for
sus
you.
Yeah,
colaboradores.
sometimes they have this commitment with it, but I think
A veces
that
tienen ese compromiso,
that not always happens with
Okay.
all of them.
pero no siempre ocurre.
So, and the evidence of that is you have to
Entonces la
push.
evidencia es que tiene que empujarlos,
Yeah, that's right.
presionarlos. tal
What
vez.
happens when you push?
¿Y qué pasa cuando usted empuja para que algo ocurra?
I sometimes feel tired, kind of tired, sometimes.
Es cansado.
Okay, you feel tired, but what else? I
se
mean,
siente cansado. ¿Y qué
look
más?
what he's not saying.
Mire lo que no dice.
What about all the people he's pushing?
Y toda
Right?
la gente a la que
So
él
he's
está
saying, I asked him
empujando,
what
¿qué?
happens, and he says, well, I get
Y
tired.
dice, bueno, pues yo me
You know?
canso, dice.
So he hasn't told me yet anything about
No me
all
ha
the people
dicho
he's
nada
pushing. So
de la
I guess
otra
I'd like to go
gente.
back and find out not only that you're
Tengo
tired,
que
but what
averiguar, no
happens to the
solamente que
people
usted está
around you.
cansado, sino la gente que está a su alrededor,
Well,
¿qué pasa?
some of them, like I say, they have this commitment with all these events, but
Tienen el compromiso con estos eventos, sí.
some of them sometimes react like they feel also tired
Pero
or they
algunos de ellos
don't
se sienten
exactly
o
want
actúan
to
como
do
que están
all
cansados.
Do you
the
think
things.
that people are talking about you and the way you're pushing them behind your back?
¿Usted piensa que hablan
know.
detrás de sus espaldas
Maybe.
de cómo
What do you
los
think?
está empujando?
Maybe.
¿Usted qué cree? Tal vez.
I'm pretty sure. No, maybe.
Maybe.
Estoy seguro. O tal vez.
So we start to have a story, right? This
Empezamos a
story
tener
is
una
about
historia, ¿verdad?
somebody with a good intention
Alguien que
trying
tiene
to
una
increase the
intención,
learning of everybody,
tratando de aumentar el aprendizaje
pushing
a todo el mundo,
others to do things.
empujándolos para que haga cosas.
And then he's sort of tiptoeing around the consequences for the people. He says,
Y
maybe
está
they're
viendo de
tired.
puntitas,
Maybe
las
they're
consecuencias
tired.
de la otra gente. A lo mejor están
And I'm thinking,
cansados,
they're pissed.
están molestos, están enojados.
Is that, yeah. They may
Sí.
be upset. They may feel like, okay, what's the
sienten
story?
así,
Now I'm going to
enojados.
ask you.
Ahora
So,
le voy a
so
preguntar.
far, this is a very
Hasta ahora,
coherent story.
Es una
It's
historia
a
muy
tight
coherente.
story. This is a good person
Es una
trying
buena
to do a
persona,
good thing.
tratando de hacer algo
He's
bueno,
struggling so hard. He
batallando
gets very
mucho,
tired.
muy
He has to
cansado.
ask people to do things.
Le pide a las
They
cosas,
get
a la gente que haga
tired.
las cosas, se cansan.
It's a very
Y
closed, coherent story. Now
Ahí es una
I'm
historia
gonna
de mucha
open it up,
coherencia.
okay? And
Vamos
I'm
a
gonna
abrirla.
ask. If I were to ask,
si yo le preguntara,
imagine somebody that you're working closely with,
imagínese a alguien con quien trabaja muy de cerca
and it may be a she.
y a lo mejor no es ella, una chica, una
Una-
persona
that's a
femenina.
woman, and she is completely flooded with details, things she
Y
has to
está
manage.
abrumada con detalles.
Right. What would she tell me about her
¿Qué me diría?
experience of working with you if I ask
De
her?
trabajar con usted si yo le pregunto.
What? Right? So look at how much I had to struggle. So far, we get very little
Hasta
description
ahora,
of what the experience is for the
Nos
others.
dice muy poco sobre lo que
And
es la
I'm
experiencia.
bringing this into the story. And you should have seen his
Estoy
eyebrows.
metiéndolo a la
You
historia.
should have seen his face. He did this.
Y no he visto
He
la
did
cara.
this.
Así le hizo. Levantó las cejas.
So I know that
Entonces ya sé.
he's now destabilized from
Que
the
ahora
story
se
that he was telling,
desestabilizó.
and we're moving into a different
está
story
moviendo
land, a different narrative now to include the
A otra
voices.
narrativa
Okay, so
para
go ahead.
incluirlos.
Oh,
Adelante.
maybe, yeah, and actually it's a she, and maybe she's.
Sí, es una
she,
mujer.
it's so, overwhelming.
Okay.
Yeah.
Has she told you that?
¿Le ha dicho eso?
Not exactly.
Okay, what's your
No
theory?
exactamente.
What's your
¿Cuál es
theory
su teoría?
about why she hasn't told you that?
¿Por qué no se lo ha dicho?
Maybe because she's so busy working on this same
Que está
issues
muy
that we are.
ocupada trabajando.
Oh, there's the coherence.
Ahí está la
So
coherencia.
I say, why doesn't she tell you that?
¿Por
Now,
qué
I
no
want
le
you to
dice
tell
eso?
me. You tell me. Why doesn't she tell me? Why
¿Por
doesn't
qué
she
no
tell
le
him?
dice eso?
Why doesn't
Dígale.
she tell him?
¿Por qué no le dice? Díganle.
He's the boss.
Porque es el jefe.
Does she want to come and say,
Va a
so
decir, va a venir a
obviously,
decirle,
there's a hierarchy here, right? Just like
hay
your
una
hand is showing.
jerarquía aquí, ¿verdad?
There's a hierarchy, and she knows she's down here.
Y ella
He's up
sabe que está acá
here.
abajo.
And he said, when I asked him, why doesn't
Y
she say?
le
He said,
pregunto, ¿por
well,
qué no te
maybe
dice?
she's tired.
Porque a lo mejor está cansada.
Nothing about the hierarchy, nothing
Algo
about
de la
the gender
jerarquía,
differences, nothing about the role
de las
differences, nothing.
diferencias o del trabajo.
So if he has to let that in, and I asked the question
Y
to
yo le
open
hice
the
la
door
pregunta,
to
tiene
that,
que dejar eso que entre.
and he circled back to the
Y da
original
un
story.
círculo de regreso
That
a la historia.
is coherence. That's
Esa es la
coherence.
coherencia.
Got it?
I understand.
Okay,
¿Verdad?
so when you see the narratives,
Cuando ves
get a
las
story
narrativas,
going, there's a story
¿Cómo
going,
va la historia?
and you poke around a little bit to find more information, and the story
Intentas profundizar más para obtener
represents
más
itself
información,
in the
y
same
luego le das
way.
la vuelta, igual.
That's narrative coherence in action. So
Eso es
when I
acción y
find it,
coherencia
when
en la
I come up
narrativa.
against it, I'm not against
Cuando
him.
yo lo enfrento,
I'm
no es que
working
esté en
against the
contra de
coherence
él.
of the narrative, and I'll say to him,
Les digo de la narrativa.
okay, so you think that she doesn't
Le
tell
digo,
you her
¿Usted
experience
cree que no le dice su
because
experiencia
she's
a ella?
tired? Because
Porque
she's
está
tired.
cansada.
Maybe she doesn't feel
A lo mejor no
that
se siente
I'm gonna listen to her, or
o siente que no la voy a
I
escuchar.
would.
Of course you
Pero
would.
sí
You're a
lo
nice
escucharía.
fella. Yeah, you're a nice
Claro.
fella. So, but what would, let's take the generic, let's make this generic. Why
Vamos
would
a
a
hacer esto
woman
como de género genérico.
not want to give her experience, not want to share her feelings or her experience with her
No
boss?
quiere, ¿por qué no quiere compartir sus experiencias o sentimientos con el jefe?
Los ojos están así.
Los ojos le están dando vueltas.
Maybe she could feel that I could react in a
A lo
way
mejor
that,
teme que yo vaya a reaccionar de
that,
mala manera.
in a bad way to her.
So it might be a
Para ella.
fearful circumstance then,
Yeah,
right?
that's
Okay,
right.
Puede
so
haber una
it's
circunstancia.
terrible to be a boss then from that perspective because
Entonces
you're
es terrible
surrounded,
ser jefe desde ese punto
you're
de vista.
surrounded by people trying their
Circundado
best,
por personas
but afraid
que están intentando
to
pero
share
tienen miedo
important information with you about their
de
experience
compartir
or how
de
it's
su
going.
experiencia con usted.
So you have to sort of, as a boss,
Entonces,
you have
como
to
jefe lo tiene
try to
que
manage everything,
resolver, manejar
and then you
todo,
have to be practically a wizard
y ser como
to
un
start
mago,
to imagine how
prácticamente,
different
para
people
empezar a
are
imaginar
responding to the, and how it is for them, right?
Yeah,
cómo es
So
para
it's
ellos y cómo
it's a
responder.
double, triple difficulty there, right?
it
Es
is.
una
Okay.
dificultad.
So
triple,
now I've made the
cuádruple.
problem not a problem of
Entonces,
people
es
are
un
tired.
problema.
I've made the problem of how difficult it is for people to
lo
share
difícil
their
que es
experiences in a
manejarlo.
context of hierarchy, right?
En el
So
contexto de
that
jerarquía.
story that he started with is
La
now
historia con la que empezó es así.
dissipated, and we have, a new story. So that's, thank you
Y
for the
ahora
question,
tenemos una
and
nueva
thank you
historia.
for the
Thank you.
aplausos,
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias. Aplaudamos.
So I think we have a witching hour. Are we at the end of our time? We're beyond
Creo
our
que
time.
llegamos al final del tiempo,
No?
¿verdad?
We're fine? Well, maybe.
¿Estamos bien?
No. Dice, mira. I say, are we okay? And he answers,
Estamos
we're
bien.
fine. Why? Because he's the boss, and now he's bossing all
Que
you
sí,
guys.
bueno, pues él es el jefe.
Okay, so maybe we have a last question or something that
Una
anybody has
última
a
pregunta, tal vez.
reflection or a comment or anything. Yes.
¿Algún comentario o algo?
Para mí es interesante, estoy en el taller también, ver esta opción como para
It's
enriquecer
interesting
las
for me to see
narrativas.
this option.
En el modelo lineal harvariano y muy al estilo norteño
In
en
the
México,
Harvard linear model,
muy directos a veces y
we're
muy
very
enfocados,
direct,
atorados
people
muchas
from the
veces
north
en
of
esas
Mexico, very
narrativas
direct people,
que no se mueven a otros lugares con
straightforward.
facilidad. Y
They
esto
don't
como
move to
que
another
ofrece
place.
una manera muy clara
And
de
a clear
cómo
way is
enriquecer la narrativa realmente para poder buscar una solución que sea más profunda o la mejor solución posible
the narrative to find the best solution.
que habita entre esas
No.
dos personas.
No, the narrative model doesn't work to find
El
the best
modelo de
solution.
narrativa no es para
I don't
encontrar
really
la mejor
care
solución.
about
Realmente
the
no
solutions.
me interesa eso.
Because I have faith that
Porque
if
tengo
the
fe
stories are
Que
opened
las historias se
and
abran
slightly more complex,
y que sean más
people have
complejas,
increased options to do
que tengan
things.
más opciones,
And then they can make their own
incremento de
solutions.
opciones,
But
Y entonces encontrarán la solución.
and we had this in class the other day, right? Where
lo tuvimos
we
en
did a
clase el
role
otro
play in
día.
class, and
En
some
un
of the
role
people
play,
were,
en una
they had a group that was very
dramatización, había un
collaborative.
grupo.
So I set the case up so there was a lot of conflict
caso, había
about
mucho.
a water shortage conflict in a community.
Era un conflicto de escasez
And the
de agua
people
en la
sat down, and
comunidad.
15 minutes later they had an agreement.
15
And the
minutos
mediator came
después,
back to the class
no
saying,
había logrado,
"Oh,
regresó
this is
el
fabulous
mediador.
because our group was so great, we made an agreement."
Nuestro grupo es muy bueno,
But from the
llegamos a tal
narrative
acuerdo.
perspective, it's like, oh
Pero desde la
no.
narrativa te quedaste así.
And because the agreement will be based on
Porque
the problematic,
el acuerdo se
coherent,
basa
very
en
closed stories.
En
And we
en el
know,
problema que tenga
statistically,
historias
at the
coherentes.
international level,
A nivel
85%
nacional, 85%
of all agreements fail
de todos los
in 5
acuerdos
years.
fallan en 5 años.
85% of peace agreements fail
85%
in 5
de
years.
acuerdos
Why?
de paz
Because they're
fallan
using
en
the
5
Harvard
años.
model.
Porque
Because the goal of the
no,
conversation
la
is
meta de la
agreement.
conversación
There is no, in these international settings, there is no
es el
increase
acuerdo.
in the complexity of the stories that
No
people
se
are
meten
telling.
en la complejidad
No
de la
way
historia.
that the Palestinians will take some
palestinos
responsibility
no
for
van a
their
tomar
actions. No way the
responsabilidad.
Israelis will
No hay
take some
manera que
responsibility.
los
No way
israelitas
that those
tomen
stories
responsabilidad.
are going to become more rich. So
Porque
I actually
otros
left
serán más
Harvard
ricos.
because I was the director of the program there, and
Yo
I
fui
left
director
that
del programa
program
en Harvard.
because the dominant discourse of
Por ese
interest-based
discurso dominante
rational choice theory was so heavy,
de esa
we
teoría
couldn't
tan
think about
pesada.
the
Si piensan en
architecture
eso,
of the problems. The
en la
architecture is
arquitectura
always
de los
narrative.
problemas,
That's what it is. So
siempre hay
anyway,
una narrativa.
so thank you so much for the question, and I
Muchas
hope the
gracias por
answer
la
was not too
pregunta.
shocking
La
for everybody.
respuesta no fue así tan,
And
tan
I thank you very much for listening. It's a
tremenda.
pleasure.
Gracias por
Thank you.
escuchar.
Con gran aprecio y reconocimiento, queremos expresar nuestra más sincera gratitud a la doctora Sara Cobb por esta conferencia magistral con el tema Modelo Circular Narrativo. Y me permito comentarles que además de ser profesora emérita de la Escuela Carter para la Paz y la Resolución de Conflictos de la Universidad George Mason, ella es autora de numerosos artículos en revistas especializadas. En este momento, el director del Instituto de Mecanismos Alternativos está haciendo entrega de un reconocimiento, así como de una tabla típica norestense de nuestro estado, como reconocimiento por su participación en esta Semana de la Mediación 2024. Agradecemos a todos los asistentes por haber estado presente en estas actividades del día 3 de la Semana de la Mediación, recordándoles que continuamos con los talleres que se impartirán en las sedes y horarios que ya conocemos.